Australian of Egyptian background, and I've personally been subject to the application of stereotypes based on my colour and my surname. So assumptions have been made about my place of birth, my nationality and my beliefs before I even open my mouth. And I don't appreciate those types of assumptions being made. However, I do appreciate a good parody every now and then. And the first, although, I mean, I'm not suggesting that we should be publicising offensive content, but the first question I have for the panel is, where do we draw the line between what is healthy and comical parody and what is offensive and unhealthy? And my second question is, if we do start to over-censor things like shows on Netflix, are we actually going to add more to the problem by further making invisible the fact that these stereotypes do exist?
Shaun. Well, that's a very interesting question. I guess because it's not available on Netflix doesn't necessarily mean it's censored, because I suppose you can get these shows, you just have to look a bit harder for them. But it helps every now and again to have a bit of an audit of your inventory, I think, whether it be Netflix or perhaps even the ABC. I know the ABC, in response to the Black Lives Matter movement, have decided to have a look at its back catalogue and make sure that whatever's available on iView has a sense that somebody's looked at it and applied some sort of sensitivity to the selection.
We're obviously talking about cancel culture. A number of individuals have been targeted and cancelled, as it were. As a comedian that's been working for decades, do you look back and think through what you've done and ask yourself, have I done things that are no longer acceptable? Yeah. Certainly, when the Me Too movement started to gain some traction, I think a lot of people did an audit and had a look at themselves professionally and privately, and certainly with the Black Lives Matter movement, I've wondered about that myself, because obviously a lot of comedy shows have come up for a bit of a hit, and I certainly remember John Cleese talking about Fawlty Towers with the Germans episode, and there was a racial slur used by a character in that particular episode. And he pointed out that the BBC had, I think as recently as the early 90s, decided to snip that particular reference anyway with his consent and approval. And indeed, when Cleese came over here to Australia to launch the stage version of Fawlty Towers, in which the Germans episode featured, he decided to remove it. So I think as long as the creator's involved, I think it's a good idea to revisit things, particularly if they're still popular. I know that if... well, Mad as Hell's been running 9-10 years now, and I think if the ABC decided to make it all available on iView, I would welcome the opportunity to sit down with the ABC and maybe just look at things and see how they land now, and stuff that's even older more so. So I think it's a healthy thing. Christopher Pyne, how do you feel about cancelling artistic pursuits from the past, or even recent expressions of art, or even statues?
Well, I think you've got to have some common sense about it. And I think that there was an example recently of Gone with the Wind being edited or cancelled because of the character of Mammy, who was the slave. But you can't actually make a movie about the Civil War in the United States without having black slaves in it. It doesn't actually mean that you are parodying black people as slaves. It means it's a proper historic record of what happened.
I think it was the way she was portrayed, though. I think
the way she was portrayed.
Hattie MacDonald's performance.
But that becomes very granular then. You start to say, I don't like the way she was portrayed. But there was also a whole movement to cancel Gone with the Wind. But I think that's different. And I would not cancel Gone with the Wind, because I don't think you can make a Civil War movie without black slaves. On the other hand, I think the blackface of some of the comedies that have been taken off by the ABC...
You're talking about Chris Lilly? Yes,
I think that's the right thing to do, because that's modern and it's completely unnecessary, and it's clearly racially profiling black people in an inappropriate way, and we should know better than that.
But then you've written arguing that a statue of the former South Australian Premier Charles Kingston should remain.
Of course.
Even though he was a very vocal supporter of the White Australia policy.
Well, everyone was in the 1890s, including most of the leaders of the trade union movement.
So are you making a judgment call then about what you think is acceptable forms of racism?
My column said that let's be sensible about this argument. I don't think we should have a statue of a slave trader in Bristol on display. But Charles Cameron Kingston was the Premier who brought in votes for women in 1894 and allowed women to stand for Parliament for the first Parliament in the world in South Australia. He led industrial relations reform that supported the rights of workers. He was no right-wing racist. Now, most people in the 1890s were in favour of the White Australia policy. Some are still in favour of the White Australia policy, sadly, but he was no different to all politicians of the time, and that is not a reason to remove his statue. Whereas I don't think we should have a statue of a slave trade, and I don't think we should have a Rangers called King Leopold Rangers.
Well,
I think it's all...
You just said he was no right-wing racist. Can you be certain that he wasn't a racist, given that he was a...
Well, he could have been a racist, but I meant in the current way that we think of racists being right-wing, some of the people in the British UKIP party, etc., some of the things that they've said. He wasn't that kind of person. His values of being in favour of the White Australia policy... I mean, Alfred Deakin was in favour of the White Australia policy, and the left hold him up as a great doyen of interference from government in the economy. And he was a Liberal, of course, so I support him very strongly. But so you have to actually make a sensible historical call. You can't just say anybody who was in favour of the White Australia policy, let's remove their statues.
Brooke?
But it's different if obviously a slave trader in Bristol's a different story.
I thank you for your question, Sarah. And, you know, I think all of this cancel culture stuff it's happening at a really, really difficult time for all of us. There's so many massive questions. I think what they ended up doing with Gone with the Wind was making a little film at the start of it that they showed to provide context,
right.
And then they put it back up. So it was originally cancelled by
That's
HBO
sensible.
Max. That's sensible.
Could you do that with? Could you do that with the statue? You put another plaque on the back.
Well, yeah,
or on
this
the
is
side?
what I think. I actually think you could do
probably
that.
could.
Because I think that the problem that I have with statues, I mean, not that I walk around Hyde Park and am offended by statues that I see. I think it's a massive distraction, and I'll get to that in a minute. But I think what would be more helpful to people and to Aboriginal people is to have a more complete version of history available. And, you know, if we are going to walk around and see statues, then we'll say, you know, this person meant this at the time and this was the context that they existed in.
Completely.
But, you know, this is the impact that those sorts of views had on women or on Aboriginal people or on whoever at the time. And, you know, maybe if we are going to have weird statues around the place, we could put up some statues of other heroes like Barangaroo or Bennelong. I mean,
Or Pemulwuy.
Or Pemulwuy. Bennelong was the first Aboriginal man to speak English. That's an incredible achievement. Like, what an amazing intellect that man must have had. And I think that a lot of people would go, oh, Bennelong, that's where the Opera House is, or that's some lovely restaurant or whatever. Like, they wouldn't actually know who Bennelong is. And if we are going to have these statues, then it's important that we tell a more complete story of our history.
I agree. Yeah.
But I also think that this debate is incredibly frustrating because it's happening at a time when we're talking about young people dying, black people dying. And, you know, the other day I woke up from a nap and I saw on Twitter that Ken Wyatt and the Prime Minister were talking about having an Indigenous incarceration close the gap target of 2093. And I thought, how long have I been napping for? Like, what is going on here? This is ridiculous. And so, you know, I'm not offended by statues. I'm a little bit offended by some TV shows, but I don't really care. I'm not offended by, you know, Redskins or Chicos. I mean, obviously I would prefer if they weren't there. It's obviously awful to walk into the supermarket and see like a racial slur written on some cheese. And but I would much rather that we're talking about things that actually make a difference in the lives of Aboriginal people. Things like early childhood education rates, things like the, you know, incarceration rates, things like justice reinvestment that are actually helpful and not just virtue signalling.